Today on this episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take, we will be discussing conspiracy theories in the USA with professor at Stanford University and best-selling author Renée DiResta. Learn how polarized politics, incentivized media, and public distrust have all escalated over time, leading to the origins of fake news and misinformation. Question is, where are we headed and how do we validate current events? Much more on this podcast episode. Welcome back, everyone. Here's my take on Professor Renée DiResta. She is an expert on our crazy world of conspiracy theories. It seems like every day new unfounded ideas are propagated through our society without evidence, data, or facts. Why have we seen such an escalation in conspiracy theories over time? Is it our divergent government entities? Is it our unregulated social media? What about our biased media outlets? Or is it our increasingly skeptical population? Well, it seems to be a combination of all the above. This interview got me hyped. Where are we headed? Everyone seems to not only have an opinion, but fake news to propagate as well. How do we limit these potentially dangerous propagandas? Is there really any way to curtail them? Ultimately, will we even be able to tell fact from fiction? Listen up as we discuss conspiracy theories in the USA. Check it out. Hey, Renee, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Listen, it's great to have you on the podcast. I'm excited to talk about a very controversial and timely topic with the elections just occurring, and that is conspiracy theories in the U.S., and excited to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, happy to chat.
Let's start with the basic question of what is a conspiracy theory? What qualifies as a conspiracy theory?
So it refers to a belief in which people attribute a group with malign motives to having committed a particular action. So using a specific example, it would be something like, all the power goes out in your neighborhood. Instead of assuming that there's just a storm or a power grid problem, you think, well, they did it because they wanted to shut down the power so that they could go and commit some sort of nefarious act, right? So it attributes a motive to an unexplained event or a emerging event, and it assumes that there is some group with some sort of malice behind them that has deliberately created or caused that action.
How do these conspiracy theories arise?
So oftentimes they arise because an event happens in the world, and people are looking for an explanation, and maybe an explanation is not forthcoming, or people don't feel that the explanation is satisfying. And when that happens, they go looking for a scapegoat, maybe somebody to blame, particularly if they feel personally impacted by it, or if they're afraid that they will be personally impacted by it, or that their friends and family will be. And so they go looking for alternate explanations that can place blame on someone, because it creates a little bit more of a sense of control. It's not a random happenstance bad thing that's happened. Somebody has caused it, and therefore that means there is somebody to blame, potentially somebody to hold accountable eventually.
Now, there's a lot of conspiracy theories, but certain ones take root better than others and are more successful in propagating. What factors predict a successful conspiracy theory as opposed to one that just falls apart and never gains traction?
There's some interesting ideas about that. So I'll start by just saying sometimes it's a very complicated, big event. The World Trade Center, for example, the attack on the World Trade Center on September 11th sparked massive amounts of conspiracy theories because it was so sensational. Everybody saw the footage. There was a sense that there's no possible way something as small as an airplane hitting a building could have caused that kind of devastation. Additional buildings kind of collapsed, were left structurally unsound and collapsed afterwards. There was an entire set of conspiracy theories about whether that was some sort of controlled demolition. Because of the geopolitical nature of that, there were opportunities to bring in these frequent villains, right? Or frequent malign actors or people that we attribute things to, like the CIA, right? Or the FBI, the New World Order, these groups that you hear about that come up time and time again, because there's a sense that they have been puppet masters of past events, that past events, other events, revolutions in other countries haven't been quite what they've seemed to be. And so these particular villains, if you will, these particular puppet masters recur time and time again. One of the things that you do see with a lot of conspiracy theories is the notion of trope, right? So everybody has seen the Bourne Identity. Everybody has seen, various spy movies in the past. We all have a sense of what the plots are like. There is some secret group plotting something. Our plucky hero's job is to figure that out. And so you see these almost kind of porting of Hollywood tropes onto real life, because again, there is some tiny grain of truth. There is some sort of longstanding belief that a particular villain is bad. And then there is this entire storytelling lore that is so ingrained in our culture that it's very easy to reach for those stories, those tropes, and those villains when a real world event arises. One thing I'll say though, really quickly, is that
Hmm.
there's a very interesting book called "Some People Are Saying," and it argues that you no longer need, or maybe it's called "A Lot of People Are Saying," but it basically argues that you no longer really need a cohesive story. You can just say, oh, the CIA, and then everybody kind of fills in the blanks in their head. Like there's not necessarily, it's conspiracy without the theory. The argument is the villain did this. And if you stop and think about like, well, why would the villain do that? Well, we don't have to explain that anymore. We just say like, oh, the CIA, right? And that's enough. And so that is a dynamic that you see happening, particularly within communities that have long-standing conspiratorial beliefs, that just sort of a nod or a reference to a common villain glosses over the fact that there's either no evidence or no justification for why a particular actor would have done a particular thing.
It's crazy. People can't really separate cinema from the real world, and what happens in the movie theater is very different than what happens in the real world. But most of these conspiracy theories uh, are really have no science, no data to back them. That's why they are conspiracy theories. But what type of people or groups are susceptible to these unfounded ideas? I mean, most people who are educated, who understand that there's evidence-based decisions being made that are rational. What type of people believe in these conspiracy theories that have no evidence, no data, and seem completely irrational?
So it's kind of an everybody, actually. I mean, the research into conspiracy theories consistently finds that even educated people who pride themselves on rationality will hold some sort of conspiratorial belief. There's just something that you know, you just can't quite accept the official story on, and you're there. You're in the health profession. A lot of the early studies on anti-vaccine believers, the vaccines cause autism belief, back in the early 2010s, that was actually mostly liberal educated people. Was people who had higher degrees of education were more likely to not vaccinate their children for a while there. Now that's shifted pretty significantly over the last decade, but for a long time that was the sort of demographic that felt that there must be something to that, to those claims. And because they had perhaps some advanced or more sophisticated or developed knowledge of chemistry or biology, even at a rudimentary level, they felt that, well, I am a smart person and I find this plausible, ergo it must be true. And again, it was very, very difficult, even as health officials and the CDC and others put out commentary trying to say, here are the studies, here's the data, here are the facts. You actually did find that people were willing to assume that something was being covered up because they felt that the argument that they were hearing was plausible and it comported with perhaps their own experience or a family member's experience. And so that lived experience meant that they were much more willing to believe it. So there is really sort of a conspiracy theory for every class and education level. It's I think a recognition that human beings as a species look for that pattern matching, those stories, deep lore really resonates with us. And it's not as easy to dispel by just saying, here, let me show you the facts.
So there is no correlation, just to be clear, between education and intelligence and the propensity to believe in unfounded conspiracy theories. Or is there? It's just not 100%.
Most of the things I've seen, that's not the kind of research that I do, so I don't want to like say maybe I missed a study. But most of what I've seen in that regard is that there are. It's not necessarily correlated to that. It's really much more a function of people's degree of trust. Conspiracy theories are much more resonant with people who have a low degree of trust in the system, so to speak, who feel that the government does not work for them, the system does not work for them, the economy is not working for them. Like there are things kind of in their lives and their lived experience that make them open to believing that that someone is actively working against them or their community or their group.
Some people have compared these conspiracy theories to cults. Is there any is there any value in that? Do you think that's accurate that these conspiracy theories form a unified vision and a cult?
So there are a few that do. QAnon, for example, the conspiracy theory that began in late 2017, early 18, began to argue that there was a secret cabal of global pedophiles and Donald Trump was fighting against them. And one of the things that was very interesting about QAnon, and you can really see the mechanics of conspiracy theorizing come into play, is that this entity that called itself Q would put out drops, these sort of cryptic communications. And what was appealing about the cryptic communications was that the people in the community felt that they were able to go and investigate and figure out the truth that was being kept from them. And one of the dynamics that started to happen there was that they would try to pull in other members of their family. They would really sort of try to, evangelize. It became something that was very, very interesting to people that they spent a lot of time doing. And you would see the rise of these groups like on Reddit where people would say, I can no longer talk to my family member about anything other than this. Like, this is all they want to talk about. This is all they want to do. They believe this so sincerely. They are living in this, this alternate universe, this alternate reality. I can't break through. I can't convince them that it's not true. And what you start to see is because a lot of this is happening on social media, I kind of joked around about this in 2018 and said the market for cult leaders has been sort of disrupted. Like people are just sort of assembling into groups, and people within the group become more or less influential depending on how persuasive people found their interpretation. They became almost like chief commentators or leaders within the sort of that sort of community. But as that grew, that social system whereby people were spending so much of their time digesting these Q drops and trying to figure out the truth of the universe led to a lot of people being very alienated from their real friends and family and a lot of breakups. And so in that particular regard, some of the conspiracy theories that lead people to form those ties, to kind of break up with their families, to sort of move into an environment where they actively distrust everything outside of what that community tells them, is evocative of the dynamics of cults. And so it's not all of them. It's a small subset whereby that belief requires leaving behind other beliefs or divorcing oneself from prior ties and friends and family that's much more evocative of the dynamics of a cult than your average conspiracy theory.
It's unbelievable. Like you said, people will push away what they've had around them for their entire lives for a completely unfounded, something that has no data, no evidence, and it's just a conspiracy theory. And it's so powerful that it will cause them to change their entire life, like you're saying. And you also mentioned a good point about public distrust, which clearly that's been mentioned as the center of where these conspiracy theories come from. It's people do not believe in the system. What is the biggest cause of public distrust in the year 2024?
The biggest cause, that's a tough one. A lot of the studies that we see are more measuring distrust. And so you see trust in media declining, and it's not uniform across the entirety of the public, right? You see this divide between Democrats and Republicans in the United States along different dividing lines in other parts of the world. But there's a sense that social media might show you some unvarnished truth, and the media doesn't report on it, or the media reports on it differently, or covers it in a way that you believe is not authentic or accurate. You don't like the framing of a headline, and so you decide that that the entire the entire enterprise is a lie, and they're trying to control your mind, right? And so you do see that trust being reallocated. You see trust declining in institutions. You see trust declining in media. Trust in government's been low for a couple decades now. So it's more a function of the amalgamation of these different types of things. Because if you distrust government, you might say, well, I don't like what the government is saying to me. I don't believe, we can stick with the vaccines and autism example. You would actually hear people say for a very long time, well, I still trust my doctor, right? You hear this in the context of government too. Well, I trust my congressman, my local official, the person I know, but this big faceless system, that I don't trust. And so there's a challenge between, and you see this in media as well, these sort of faceless institutions versus the one person who is listening to you, responding to you, and unfortunately, in the case of social media, sometimes just telling you what you want to hear. Um, During COVID, you did start to see, again, split along partisan lines, some decline in trust in scientists and doctors as well, particularly as things like the COVID vaccine were politicized and began to split along partisan lines. And so you do see that, again, that fragmenting of trust, where there's a pretty big delta between conservative versus liberal points of view around trust in the system.
Now, a certain level of these conspiracy theories may be necessary, people say, for a functioning, healthy democracy. It basically balances the power, allows political dissent. Can you explain why that may be true? Just to have a low level of these conspiracy theories is normal and healthy?
Yeah, well, I mean, sometimes conspiracies turn out to be true, right? And so you don't want to tell people, no, you should blindly trust the system. We should all trust everything the government says. We should all trust everything an institution or the media says. You want to have that skepticism, that pushback, that dialogue. Where we start to get into challenges is when the no matter how much evidence or communication or data or where there is no way to refute that belief at all, because the degree of trust is so low that we cannot agree on facts, we cannot come to consensus. And that, unfortunately, is one of the big challenges with the political polarization around this today, is just that you see very different sets of beliefs in who is a trusted voice and how seriously we should take a particular problem. And as you extrapolate out, ahead of the next pandemic, for example, you have people whose opinions are very much now shaped by the experience in the last one. And so it's going to be even more difficult for people who are distrustful of institutions to believe and to listen to and to act in accordance with what an institution might tell them the next time.
Now, you mentioned earlier in the interview about the media, and I really want to focus on that because many people believe that today's media is the reason for much of the public distrust that's going on. Explain the power of U.S. media and journalism and how they can control what the American people see and hear and believe.
So I think we have I've been trying to think of like how to describe this, like almost like a multipolar system in media today, right? You have the old legacy, if you will, broadcast media, print, radio, television, that grew up over a period of centuries to decades. And they are oftentimes what appears in them is determined by an editor or a producer or a gatekeeper of information, a curator of some sort. And there's a human being or a group of human beings who are making that determination. So there's a sense that this leads to incentives shaping coverage. Noam Chomsky wrote a great book about this in the 1980s called Manufacturing Consent, where he goes into the dynamics that shape what media puts out. So advertisers, right? If broadcast and print media are dependent on advertising, then they might not want to tell stories that are critical of the industries that are paying them So pharmaceuticals is one example that comes up quite commonly. If pharma companies are advertising in media, media might not cover their executives or their wrongdoing or harms caused by drugs quite so clearly. Um, so you have these different incentives. Media decides who is an expert, right? By quoting somebody, by putting them into the paper. That means that there is sometimes a relationship there where then they might not want to alienate that source or that expert, and so they might not cover them quite so directly, which leads to distrust because it gives you the sense that a whole system exists that makes these gatekeepers decide not to show you something. Social media is the other kind of pull now that we've had for, gosh, where are we? Almost 25 years, depending on when you want to start the clock, right? The sort of early days of the internet and the blogosphere, where there's a set of incentives there too, where you're really working to capture attention. You're really targeting a niche, whereas mainstream media had to reach a far broader audience in order to justify its economics. Influencer media is really targeting a very specific group of people. There's a phenomenon of audience capture. They too are really incredibly dependent on subscriptions, which means they might not want to tell their audience what they don't want to hear, lest they cancel their subscriptions and go to somebody who will. So the incentives really shape the outputs. And what happens on social media as well is instead of human gatekeepers that are directly saying we are going to cover this and not cover that, on social media, you have algorithms that are curating. So among all of the universe of posts in the world, they're going to show you something that they think you personally want to see. And that creates a weird, even more fragmented environment where what you see and what your neighbor sees are potentially very, very, very different visions of the world, leading you to develop very different concerns, very different sense of who to trust, and potentially even a sort of a kind of fragmentation of this idea of reality because we're not all operating in a world with the same stories.
Now, like you said, media has a bunch of different incentives, the least of which is providing the truth. They really want to tailor to their advertisers and people that are funding them, and they all have different incentives. With that in mind, do you believe there's any reliable, unbiased news source in the US?
I do. Well, I think it's unfair to say that they're kind of like not looking to tell you the truth. I actually really don't. I don't believe that. I think that legacy outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Associated Press, Reuters. I mean, there's a ton of different outlets out there. And one thing that they have that niche social media influencers do not is journalism, right? They have reporters who are in the field. How they process what they see in the field is an interesting challenge, but that they actually have people there, that they're doing more than commentary, I think is actually very important. And I think if you consume a spectrum of those outlets, ranging from, again, AP and Reuters, which are often news wires, just kind of like get the basic facts out there, to Wall Street Journal versus the New York Times, you do see oftentimes kind of common basis of fact, even if the editorial pages disagree on how to message those facts or what the opinions around those facts or what we should do with those facts is. So I do think that consuming a broad-based media diet is actually still useful. I feel like the social media is an interesting place right now because it has this like we are the media now attitude, right? We have replaced the legacy media. And to some extent, that's true. They've created this alternate, again, kind of pole, if you will, of entities that you can pick from and choose. But they often lack the journalistic enterprise. They're often largely commentary, and that's fine. Get your commentary from wherever you want. But I think that we should see these things as complementary, and that a healthy media diet involves kind of consuming from among all of it, as opposed to just saying, I'm going to place 100% of my trust and 100% of my, basis for belief in the world and like this one outlet over here. So my personal media diet ranges from substacks across the political spectrum to mainstream media across the political spectrum, and kind of like make sense of the world by looking at all of it as opposed to being over reliant on any one source.
Now, what are your thoughts on how politicized media has become? So, for example, Fox and MSNBC, the same world event is 180 degrees different between the two stations, which is crazy because it's one world event, right? It's not, there's just
Yeah.
one event happened. And yet, if you're on Fox, you have one opinion. And if you're on MSNBC, you're getting a completely opposite opinion. How politicized are these networks? And what does that do to the American people, depending on what channel they turn to?
Yeah, well, that I think actually is the question, right? Is how do you know share a common reality when things are messaged so differently? Um, First of all, I think the whole this outlet is whenever I hear an outlet say all of those other people are biased, you should trust me. I feel like that's actually a huge red flag. I don't like it. I don't like it from either side of the political spectrum. I feel like that's evocative more of like it's a marketing campaign, right? It's giving people you should come to me, you should spend your eyeballs here, your time here, your and this is happening across social media too. Every platform is in competition, every influencer is in competition. So I do think people just need to recognize that language at this point as a red flag. Um, and if when you have the people who spend all of their time in one universe or another, I do think unfortunately that they do wind up with very, very distorted perceptions of the world. I don't know what the end state solution is for that with mass media, because people have agency, they choose what channel to turn to. So I think creating I mean, the one nice thing about social media is you can envision a world where seeing more and disparate sources is actually made easier over there. The question right now is how does the economics of that work? Substack is challenging because you can subscribe for free, but in order for those creators to continue to write, people have to eventually pay them, and then you're paying $5 to $10 a month for one opinion writer, and that becomes quite costly if you're envisioning maybe you want to follow 3 or 4 to get a spectrum, and you're looking at like $40 a month, whereas the Washington Post or the New York Times offers something, or the journal's pretty expensive. But you do have that dynamic of where do people spend their dollars to become informed. So it is a competition for eyeballs. I do wish we would be a little bit more clear-eyed about the fact that you should trust us, not them, is a marketing slogan from an outlet that is trying to make sure that you pay with your attention, time, and dollars for them, whatever their niche in the political spectrum is.
What do you think about adopting a BBC type network that is grounded in not so much commentary, but just the facts, presenting you the facts, letting you digest it, form your own opinions? I mean, I personally think that it's a great idea, but people aren't going to pay for that. It's not going to grab the viewers. People, unfortunately, in this day and age, they want drama, they want
Yeah.
sensationalism, they want action. If someone like Walter Cronkite's on there and he's just giving you the facts, I feel like people aren't going to watch that.
No, I think, and that's the challenge, right? Like you, I love the idea. I mean, that's what I want. I also recognize, when I stay in I don't have TV, and I think that for a lot of people, 40 and under, you have streaming services, you have the internet. We've sort of moved away from cable news, but whenever I go and stay in a hotel, I will usually put on Fox News because I feel like it's like I'm going to go and it's like entertaining. I'm not going to trust a single thing I see on it. But for the entertainment factor, like that night in that room, I'm going to watch some random program of people fighting with each other for an hour. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I even doing what I do, like that's my that's sort of my default. Because it's like infotainment, and I don't know what the answer is. I think I have kids who are in elementary school now, middle school, and there's a big push towards um, media literacy or information literacy that tries to tell them, hey, everything you see on YouTube isn't real, right? Everything you see on the internet is not real. And it's sort of an interesting shift from media literacy 20 years ago, which might have said check multiple sources, recognize that, Fox caters to conservatives and MSNBC to liberals, and, look at a bunch of different things. And now you're seeing that happening at an even more granular level for kids. So I think this is where, though, I think politicians and institutions and people that the media covers have to do a better job at being on all of the programs. Oftentimes you'll see a politician will go on an outlet that is going to be friendly to them as opposed to an outlet that is going to challenge them. And they can do that and they can continue to shore up the base, but then you're not hearing that alternate perspective. So I actually always find it really fantastic when I see like Pete Buttigieg on Fox News, for example. And I'm curious to see, as the administration shifts in the next couple of months, what that is going to look like, whether that investment will be made by, members of President Trump's cabinet going on to liberal or left-wing media to kind of argue the case of the administration with respect over there versus making it just a constant combat.
Now, are we unique in the US, or do these conspiracy theories plague all industrialized countries?
Oh, it's all over the world. It it really just depends on what there's some commonalities in the tropes. One thing that was really surprising to me actually was that QAnon became popular in Germany and in other parts of Europe, despite the fact not massively popular, but enough of it had enough of a presence that you would see it at reflected at protests and the political discourse, some of the online media. What was interesting to me about that was that it was such an intensely American kind of core idea, this particular network of, this Democrat pedophile network that they argue existed, right? Baselessly. And yet it did kind of migrate out to other countries. But what they do very quickly is they kind of put their own spin on it, right? There's their own set of political villains. So the tropes are the same, but that question of like, who do you finger point at? Who is the guilty party? Who is the secret puppet master? That shifts according to the culture and dynamics of the country that it appears in. And this is true all over the world.
Now, it's clear over the last 10 to 20 years that these conspiracy theories are increasing in numbers. Oh, are they here to stay? Is fake news and conspiracy theories escalating over time here to stay, or is there any way to curtail this? Because it seems like it's taking over and it's actually more impactful than the data-driven information that we're getting.
So conspiracy theories have always been around. So some of it is increasing visibility, which means that, but the area where that increase is happening is as they've become more visible and as they have become a way for people to spend time together, to engage, to have an identity around, it's become much more normalized, right? There's the idea that you can believe this thing and kind of reject wholesale anything that comes from outside of the community is something that, social media has made easier to do. In the olden days, if you will, you would discuss these things with your neighbors who would have different perspectives and would probably give you some pushback. Now you can simply kind of pick your own reality and go live in it. So that dynamic is, I think, unfortunate. One of the areas that social media can shift things a bit is by rethinking how people are recommended into groups, or what kind of content is curated, what kind of content is amplified. One way that we see this beginning to happen now is asking questions like, can you highlight contentious political topics in, expressed by people who aren't demonizing their opponent or accusing somebody of being part of a vast cabal, but instead are asking about that underlying concern. So can you bridge communities by surfacing the kinds of conversational styles that we would have excuse me, in the real world? And is that a way to get us back to a place of productive dialogue? I think that need for counter speech, that need for engagement also requires institutions to adapt themselves to communicating in the modern era. I spend about a chapter in the book going into all the things that I thought they did wrong during COVID. There were plenty of COVID conspiracy theories, but there was also this sense that the institutions were just not having the same conversation. They just weren't there. And they weren't sending physicians to go speak on the podcasts of the most deeply skeptical communities. There was just it was like entirely separate universes. And I think that we really have to do better about that. So there's a combination of what algorithms incentivize, again, what are the gatekeepers of our time incentivize? And then the other piece of it is, how do we have that direct engagement with communities across political divides, across regional or belief divides? What are the ways in which we get that done?
Listen, Renee, a really unbelievable interview. I think the take home point, at least the one I got, is that in this day and age, there's so many avenues for information, and we're getting hit by media, social media, friends, colleagues, and we have to form our own ideas and do our research and make sure that we're making the right decisions. It just becomes so difficult when there's so many streams of information and you don't know what's valid and what's not. And I think it becomes a real challenge for the younger generations as that information stream increases. It's almost overload with what you're hearing. There's one event in the world and you get a million different opinions, and you got to figure out which one you
Yeah.
want to believe in and which one's accurate. So I don't really know when it's going to be curtailed, or if it even can be curtailed. And there's just so much public distrust, and everything comes with a question mark. And social media, everyone has a voice, right? So even if you're not a doctor, even if you're not a scientist, you can comment on vaccines. Whether that's right or wrong is a whole nother opinion. But if it's not your expertise and you're broadcasting it, and then other people who aren't experts in it listen to your belief, and it's complicated. It's very, very complicated, and I'm not sure if you know what's going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years. Any predictions?
No, I mean, I think it's great that, folks like you, right, where you have an entire different set of experiences, you have a basis to communicate with an audience and to help them make sense of the world, given your own deep expertise. I think that's really important. I used to wonder, I remember talking to people at Berkeley School of Public Health, like, God, almost 10 years ago now, and them saying, like, should we all get on Twitter? And I thought, like, you got jobs. But I give a very different answer today, right? Which is like, yes, you've got to be in that conversation. Maybe not Twitter, pick one, whatever makes you happy. Go on TikTok, go on YouTube, Reels, whatever format does it for you. But it is needing to see that direct engagement, and that people who have these deep degrees of expertise in a particular topic. We don't want expertise and influence to be decoupled, right? We want people who have that expertise to be influential. And in order to do that, they have to be in the public conversation also.
Crazy times. Let's see what happens over the next 4 years. I really appreciate your time, Renee. Unbelievable
Thanks. Appreciate yours
expertise.
too. Thanks.
Have a wonderful weekend.
You too.